listening to Turning Hard Times into Good Times with your host, Jay Taylor. If you have a question or comment about today's show, Jay would love to hear from you at 1-866-472-5790. That's 1-866-472-5790. You can also send an email to questionsfortaylor@gmail.com. That's questions, the number 4, Taylor@gmail.com. Now, back to our program.
Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am happy to have with me once again James Rickards. So James is the author of the best-selling Currency Wars. The Death of Money is another book that he's written. And now he is here to talk to us about his latest book titled The Road to Ruin, The Global Elite's Secret Plan for the Next Financial Crisis. Well, most of you know Jim very well, so I don't want to spend time on his bio. But for those of you who would like to know a little bit more about him, you can find a more complete bio at go to the Voice America. Go to my page, this show's page at the Voice America Business Channel, and it is posted there. Welcome, James. Thanks for joining me again.
Thanks, Jay. Great to be with you.
Yeah, it's always good to hear from you. I really, you're not on major media enough as far as I'm concerned. I'd love to see you there more often. I really enjoyed, I think it was at the end of last year, I saw you on Bloomberg, and I know you are on a lot of the major networks from time to time, but as far as I'm concerned, not often enough, because your voice is one crying in a wilderness to a certain extent anyway. I do want to get into your new book, but I'd like to just maybe a question or two or touch on the Currency Wars book written in 2011. You quite correctly predicted that the Federal Reserve would not raise interest rates for years to come. Well, we've seen one small quarter-point interest rate rise since then, I guess. But it seems that, and they keep promising us that we're going to have another rate rise. It's just around the corner. The economy is going to get stronger, and it will warrant a rate rise, so don't worry. But we get around the corner, and the rate rise never seems to come. Now it seems as though the Fed is backing down once again. Well, how much longer do you think this game can go on, where they promise, and then they can't deliver because the economy is so weak?
Well, it's a great question, Jay, and you're right, it is a game. Now, of course, the November meeting, there's no rate hike. That's no surprise. But the Fed will raise interest rates at their December 2016 meeting. So you can count on that. I actually had dinner recently at our club with Bill Dudley. Of course, he's the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, probably the second most powerful central banker in the world after Janet Yellen, permanent voting member of the FOMC. And he told me just flat out that they're going to raise rates in December. I was actually a little surprised. Now, just to be clear, he was speaking personally. He wasn't an official Fed position, but usually they load that up with a lot of caveats. But they're going to raise rates in December. We can see that coming. The question is, where do we go from there? Because remember, the last time they raised rates, which was a year ago almost, December 2015, the stock market fell 11% in the following 8 weeks, starting January 1st through February 10th, 2016. It fell 11%. It would have fallen more, but for the fact that the Fed actually started with Dudley in late January, started engaging in their happy talk, their happy dance, and saying, well, because in December 2015, they laid out a whole program, and you're right, they were going to raise rates 4 more times in 2016, again 2017, get them up to 3% by the end of 2018. Well, they completely backed off from that. There were no rate hikes through all of 2016 until now, December. So that's how they turned the market around. By the way, they did the same thing about 4 months earlier. Remember, they originally planned the liftoff for September of 2015, but then August 10, 2015, you had this shock Chinese devaluation of the yuan, part of the currency wars, and then the stock market fell out of bed then. Fell also about 11%, a little more, in a matter of 3 weeks. And again, the Fed saved the day by backing away from their own planned rate hikes. So there is this pattern of saying they're going to raise, and then markets fall out of bed, and then they back off. But now the coast is clear. Markets anticipated. They've warned everyone they're going to do it. The job creation side of things is okay. Third quarter GDP came in a little stronger than expected. So the coast is clear. But after that, as soon as they do, I would expect the stock, as I say, stocks will fall out of bed again. Then they'll just have to back off. So it's a little bit of a game, but I analogize it to a kid who's trying to steal money from his mother's wallet. If mom's not looking, he might go grab a dollar, but if mom's watching him, he's not going to do anything. If the Fed thinks they can get away with a rate hike, they will, but more often than not, they can't, because markets are too upset. But it looks like the coast is clear for December. They will raise rates then.
All right. Well, in your new book, The Road to Ruin, you suggest that the global elites have a secret plan for the next financial crisis. Who are these global elites?
Well, it's a great question, because they're real people and we know who they are. It's not some deep, dark conspiracy. They don't sit around a boardroom with hoods on, like a Spectre out of a James Bond movie. It's Christine Lagarde and Janet Yellen and Mario Draghi and Larry Summers and Paul Krugman. And, it's central bankers, finance ministers, other policymakers, some professors, the head of the BIS. We know who they are. There aren't that many of them, maybe several hundred around the world, but it's not like 20,000 people. I mean, there are a couple hundred people who basically run the international monetary system, and they're the ones I described. They don't have a secret committee, but the way I describe it in the book, and I talk a lot about it in the book, you don't need a top-down conspiracy to make this work. You just need like-minded individuals. They all went to the same schools. They all went to either Harvard or MIT or Chicago or Yale. In many cases, they were each other's professors. A lot of the central bankers around the world today, they got their PhDs from MIT. Well, their thesis advisor was Stan Fisher, who is now the vice chairman of the Federal Reserve. So they all know each other. They show up at Davos. They show up at the Aspen Ideas Festival. Go to the Jackson Hole in August. It's a nice, cozy club. So we know who they are. They operate by consensus. They operate through just shared interests. What's important to understand is what's the agenda? Mm-hmm. What do they believe? What's their belief system? Because if you can understand that, it makes policy fairly easy to predict, because you know what the models are, what they're looking at. Their models are completely obsolete, by the way. They've blundered time and time again, and they will do so again. But they don't realize it. They don't seem to understand the mistakes they're making, so that they keep repeating them. But that actually makes it easier to forecast policy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could understand. I think that's absolutely true. But you talk about their plans for the next financial crisis. Could you talk a little about that? What do they have in mind?
Sure. I look at three financial crises as a way to analyze this. I start with 1998. That, of course, was the Asia-Russia long-term capital management meltdown. Mm-hmm. I then look at 2008. We all understand what happened there. And then I look at 2018. So that's an estimate. I don't want to put a hard stake in the ground that, on January 1st, 2018, everything's going to fall apart. It could be 2018, it could be later, but importantly for investors, Jay, it could be tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So there is a financial catastrophe coming. It will be bigger than the one in 2008. It will actually cause a different response function. I'll talk about that in a second. But don't wait a year or two. This is something that could come tomorrow. But I use 2018 just to keep up that 10-year tempo. Now, in 1998, we were hours away from shutting every stock and bond market in the world. I mean, I was there. I was in the room. I negotiated that bailout. I was in the room at a big New York law firm with Treasury officials and Fed officials and all the bankers. And I know how dangerous this situation was and how close it came to collapse. Same thing in 2008. We were just days away from the sequential collapse of every major financial institution in the world. So, Bear Stearns collapsed in March 2008. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac collapsed in June, July 2008. Lehman Brothers collapsed in September. They were falling like dominoes, but that was all about to accelerate. Morgan Stanley would have been next, then Goldman Sachs, then Citi, banking, B of A, and finally J.P. Morgan. Now, that didn't happen because the Fed intervened. The Fed truncated the process. And the point I make is that these are complex dynamic systems. They operate exactly like natural dynamic systems, earthquakes, volcanoes, and so forth, with one important difference. If an earthquake starts, you can't stop it. It's just there's a release of energy. It's just going to run its course. If a financial panic starts, you can stop it, but you don't solve the problem. All you do is store up that energy for the next one. Mm-hmm. So the point is, for 1998, Wall Street bailed out a hedge fund. 2008, the central banks bailed out Wall Street. Mm-hmm. In 2018, if not sooner, who's going to bail out the central banks? In other words, each crisis gets bigger than the one before. Each bailout gets bigger than the one before. We're now at the point where the central banks have to be bailed out because they've bloated their balance sheets. They've cut interest rates to zero. They haven't normalized anything. In the last 6 years, the Fed took their balance sheet from $800 billion to over $4 trillion. Mm-hmm. Now, if somehow they had got back down to, let's say, $1 trillion, raised interest rates to 2.5%, I'd be the first one to say, hey, nice job, guys. Congratulations. Mm-hmm. You saved the world, and you normalized your balance sheet. But that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. The balance sheet is still at $4 trillion. Interest rates are still close to zero. They have no ammo left to fight the next war. And when it comes, they're going to have to turn to the IMF. The IMF is going to reliquify the world with world money, which is the special drawing right, the SDR. I'm sure listeners have heard about it. It's not as hard to understand as it may sound at first, notwithstanding the funny name. It's just world money. The Fed has a printing press. They can print dollars. The IMF has a printing press. They can print SDRs, and they will, but it'll be highly inflationary and will destroy wealth.
It will be highly inflationary for everyone, James, or for the United States in particular. I mean, I've read some of your material recently in which you're talking about the dollar being devalued, losing its purchasing power via this basket of other currencies. The SDRs, I guess, would include gold as well, perhaps?
Well, I think gold is different. Right now, the SDR is not backed by gold. By the way, it used to be when the SDR was created in 1969. And of course, there's nothing new about them. They have been around since 1969. But originally, one SDR was defined as a specific weight in gold. They got rid of that by around 1973, 74. But ever since then, the SDR has been defined with reference to a basket of currencies. But no, look, I talk about the dollar and inflation of the dollar, but this will affect all the currencies. It's not as if, the dollar is going to be devalued and somehow the euro will be, twice as valuable. The euro might go up a little bit, but all of the currencies are going to be devalued against gold. Gold will be the only form of money that will, preserve purchasing power. As I say, I expect gold to go to $10,000 an ounce, and people say, "Oh, woohoo! I'm going to make all this money on gold." And what I explain to them is no, gold will go to $10,000 an ounce, but in today's purchasing power, it'll only be like $1,000 an ounce. What you will do, you'll preserve your wealth. You won't have a windfall. You will in nominal terms, but in real terms, it's not so much that it's a windfall. It's just that you've preserved your wealth when everyone else has been wiped out. That's valuable and that's important.
Let me understand then, why do we go to SDRs? Is that in an effort, in effect, to reflate, to create inflation, because they haven't been able to do that through their normal process?
Well, that's exactly right. But it's basically a way to create money in a way that maybe no one will notice. I mean, they'll notice, obviously, it'll be headlines, but people don't really understand SDRs. They don't understand the IMF. If it works, it will mainly be because nobody except the elites themselves understand it. But more to the point, the best definition I've ever heard of a financial panic, Jay, is everybody wants his money back. People say, "Oh, I've got money in the stock market. I've got money in the bond market." No, you don't. You may have stocks and bonds, but that's not money. People say, "I have money in a money market fund." I mean, what a misnomer. That's not money. Those are units of a mutual fund. Now, people think they can call the broker and sell the units and the money will be in their bank account the next day. But the SEC just changed the law so that for the first time, this is all very recent, money market funds are allowed to suspend redemptions. Just like a hedge fund, they can put up gates, pull up the drawbridge, and not give you your money. So you might, and I expect this will be the case in the next panic. The last panic in 2008, what was happening was that Americans were panicking. They were pulling their money out of money market funds by the billions. And then people who depended on the money market funds, such as European banks, to fund their dollar liabilities, those couldn't be rolled over. So dollar liquidity was drying up all over the world. The way the Fed intervened then is they guaranteed every money market fund in America. They just said, "Hey, we guarantee it." That was the bail-in. They're not going to do that the next time. It was that was the bailout.
Bailout, yeah.
So, that was the bailout. They're not going to do that again. It was too politically unpopular. People are still outraged. It's part of the success of Donald Trump and the Pirate Party in Iceland and the Italian referendum and Brexit. You look all over the world. This is all popular backlash against those kinds of bailout scenarios. So they're not going to do it. What they are going to do is lock it down and tell you can't have your money. And then they may have to close banks, shut exchanges. Now, eventually the SDRs will be issued. The central banks are at the outer limit of what they can do. Not legally. Legally, they can create more money, but politically and in terms of confidence, they can't print anymore without destroying confidence in their paper money. So you're going to be faced with a situation. Everybody wants his money back. You're going to have to pull it out of thin air. The central banks can't do it because they're tapped out. They never normalized from the last time. So the only clean balance sheet in the world, the only source of new liquidity in the world, is the IMF and the SDR. So that's why they're going to do it, because there's no place else to get the money.
That's the last, the last means of bailing out the world, essentially, I guess.
Correct.
So it seems to me, what you're talking about, I think probably most people don't understand, and you're the lawyer, Jim, so you can tell me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that, when you put money in the bank, you deposit your currency in the bank, you no longer are really the legal owner of that. The bank, you are a lender to the bank, right? And isn't it similar when I own stock and I have it in a brokerage firm? It's always in street name. It's not in my personal name. So if the brokerage house goes down, there are insurance things in place and so forth to the extent the government can make good on it. But we're not really legal owners of those assets so that they can be taken from us. Do I have that right?
That's correct. So if I put money in the bank, it's a misnomer. I don't consider it money. I do have money in the bank. It's a convenience. I'm no different than anyone else, but sure. It's not money anymore. My bank deposit is an unsecured liability of an occasionally insolvent financial institution. Yeah. That's what it is. I'm lending money to the bank. I'm hoping I can get it back. Mm-hmm. Now, there is deposit insurance, and some of these banks are too big to fail, but in this next financial panic, I'm not talking about today, sunny day and everything's fine. I know I can go down to the bank and get some money, but in a panic, when everyone is dumping everything, the last time they printed up the money, they guaranteed the accounts, they put everyone's mind at ease. But the problem the next time, they're not going to be able to do that. They're not going to be, for political reasons and reasons of confidence, they're not going to be able to do it again. What they're going to do is tell you you can't have your money. Now, they'll say it's temporary. Remember,
Nixon.
August 15th, 1971, Nixon said, I am temporarily suspending the convertibility of dollars into gold. It was 45 years ago, and that we still don't have a gold standard. But they'll say it's temporary. They'll be buying time until the IMF can ride to the rescue with these SDRs. And once they do that, by the way, the reason you asked a good question, Jay. You said, well, why will that be inflationary when all the money printing that's happened so far hasn't been inflationary? Uh-huh. Well, the answer is that printing money by itself does not cause inflation. Austrians believe it does, but it doesn't. You need two things. You need the money. That's a start. But you also need people to spend it, lend it, borrow it. That's the velocity of money, the turnover. By the way, just in fairness to the Austrians, we don't have inflation in prices, consumer prices or producer prices. We do have it in asset prices. So right. If you give the Austrians credit for that, that's just a different kind of inflation. So what we have are asset bubbles in stocks and real estate, but it hasn't shown up in the consumer price index. That's because people are not spending the money. This notion of helicopter money, print it up, throw it out of helicopters, it falls to the ground, people are going to scoop it up and go out and spend it. Well, people will scoop it up, but they don't have to spend it. They could pay down debt, pay off student loans, car loans, home equity loans, credit cards, etc., or just save it, and that's what people have been doing. But the difference is SDRs are not walking around money. You and I aren't going to have them. These only go to countries, and the countries will spend it. Oh, by the way, the SDRs, the IMF can give them not only to their countries, but they can give them to multilateral institutions. So they can give them to the United Nations and the World Bank, and they will. And then those agencies will pursue. They'll be spending the money on climate change infrastructure, whatever. But I guarantee that money will get spent, and that's where the inflation will come from.
Well, Jim, let me ask you, if we get to this bail-in situation, global insolvency or illiquidity in the banking system, and they start to give us all a haircut or take a portion of our deposits away from us, people are going to want to run out of the banks. Is that the reason that the likes of Joseph Stiglitz and Larry Summers and others are talking about putting together a cashless society? I mean, they talk about it being to stop the drug cartel, but I don't believe that one. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts? Is that what they've got in mind when they're starting to think in terms of a cashless society and make it all digital?
Absolutely. Before you slaughter cattle, you have to herd them into a pen.
Uh-huh.
And before you slaughter sabers, you've got to herd them into a digital pen. So what they're doing, they're basically eliminating the cash option. It's funny, Jay, people think, oh, I can go down to the bank and get my cash whenever I want. Really? Go try it. Go up to
Yeah.
a teller, ask for $15,000 in $100 bills. The teller's face will turn white.
Hmm.
She'll call over the branch manager. They'll ask you for not just identification, but why do you want the money? Some banks will say, hey, can you come back in 2 days? We don't have that much on hand. And they will file a currency transaction report with the government that goes to an agency called FinCEN, which stands for Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It'll be put into a file right next to the terrorists, the drug dealers, and the tax evaders.
Uh-huh.
Now, again, you're a totally honest citizen trying to get your own money for emergency purposes or just because you feel like it. You will be treated like a criminal. So, people ask me, how's the war on cash going? I say, it's over. The government won. If you do smaller amounts, then do that twice in a row. They'll say it's structuring, which is a crime. That's how they got Danny Hastert. He did some horrific things, but they didn't get him for those things. They got him for taking cash out of the bank to pay blackmail money. It was and he was charged with structuring. He happened to be criminal, but if you do it as an innocent citizen, they'll get you that way. And they have something else called the Suspicious Activity Report, the SAR, that they file for amounts below $10,000. So again, totally legal citizen wanting to get your own cash. I live in a place where we get hit by hurricanes, and I have batteries and a flashlight for emergencies. And I think it's a good idea to have some cash on hand for the same. Power grid goes out. We lost power for 8 days in Hurricane Sandy. Guess what? The ATMs don't work. The gas pumps don't work. The banks are closed. And if you want to, go down and get some groceries for your family, it's good to have cash. But the government's going to try to eliminate it. That's so they can impose negative interest rates, freeze it, confiscate it. So we're all being herded into these digital pens like cattle to the slaughter.
Yeah. Not a very happy prospect for those of us who grew up in days when liberty was more of a reality, I guess, and not to say what they can do with that information once they can follow whatever you're doing. It could be used for political purposes too, to make sure that there's no dissenters, that there's no revolution like 1776. For goodness sakes, we can't have liberty among the people, can we?
But what has been? I mean, look at Lois Lerner and the IRS. I mean, what was that all about? So in 2009, Rick Santelli, a great guy on CNBC, he sort of went off on a rant and started the Tea Party, maybe unintentionally, but the Tea Party was a genuine grassroots movement. It wasn't one of these top-down Washington lobbying outfits. It was, Chamber of Commerce type, small business people, housewives, others banding together, and they said, well, let's raise some money. You got to get a 501c3, send in their application to the IRS. Well, lo and behold, they were treated as guilty of thought crimes. And then when the Republicans took the Congress in 2010, the midterm elections, mostly on the strength of the Tea Party, the Obama White House decided to shut them down, and they used the IRS, probably the most terrifying organization in the government. They slow rolled those applications. They sent questionnaires out saying, well, what are your religious views? What books do you read? Et cetera. So they were all thought crimes, basically. So we've already seen it. We don't have to hypothesize this. We know that the power of government is being used to suppress liberty and suppress various kinds of thought and expression. So how much worse would it get in a financial crisis?
Yeah, it is really not a happy subject, but we want to go to your book in chapter 9, The Final Plan of the Elite. It was a hugely interesting chapter, I found, it really is, I think, where the rubber hits the road for Americans and investors as a whole. On page 278, you state, and I quote, "The final phase of this grand bargain is inflation to wipe out the real cost of global sovereign debt. If central banks could not cause inflation despite their best efforts, the IMF would create inflation for them with massive issuances of SDRs to be spent on global infrastructure and global welfare. The infrastructure needs, intermediated by the World Bank, would be targeted at so-called climate change and other elite hobby horse. So you'd have all these programs to spend money.
Right.
And then you say, now the post-crisis global elite plan is seen in full, end of quote. So I'd like to ask you if you could talk just a little bit about that plan and what practical impacts it will have on Americans. So we're going to see higher inflation rates. I guess we were talking about it, the lack of liquidity, the lack of maybe digital money. And so how do we prepare for this, or what are the real impacts of what you see coming?
Yeah, and Jay, thanks for mentioning that. By the way, I want to point out that this book has 151 endnotes. In other words, I don't make any claims that you read a passage and right, yes, that is what the book says, but you can go to the back of the book and you can find specific working papers by officials that talk about that. So this is all backed up with documentation, sure, or direct interviews, et cetera. It's very well sourced, and readers who are interested can pursue that further. But yes, that is the plan. Look, if you pull, my estimate would be 5 trillion SDRs. That's how much they'll have to create out of thin air. They give it to their member countries. You and I don't have any, but the countries do. But then inside the IMF, there's a trading desk where countries that get SDRs that want other kinds of money, dollars or euros or yen or whatever, you just call up that desk and they find a buyer for the SDRs, and China is a buyer. China's been acquiring SDRs because they're trying to get out of dollars. And so you can sell the SDRs to China. China will give you dollars, let's say, or euros, and then you as a country go spend them on whatever. Some of this will be directed. When I say directed, I mean it'll be very specific. As I mentioned, climate change infrastructure in the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars. But some of it will be at the discretion of individual countries. But as I say, if people don't want to spend, governments will. This is what John Maynard Keynes said. That was the origin of Keynesian economics. Is when you're in a liquidity trap and people are fearful and they're nervous and they're saving their money, which is actually prudent. Well, sure, if they won't spend, the government will. But then you say, okay, the government's going to spend. Where are they going to get the money?
Right.
If they're all deeply indebted, if the United States has a over 100% debt to GDP ratio, China and Japan have over 200% debt to GDP ratios. Well, they're at the outer limit of what they can borrow. Their central banks are at the outer limit of what they can print. So where's this new money going to come from? Well, voila, it's going to come from the IMF. By the way, the IMF is not a country. So it does not have a trade deficit. It does not have a budget deficit. It can, when countries print money, there are at least some constraints in terms of currency exchange values, trade deficits, budget deficits, interest rates. There's some constraints imposed by the market, but the IMF is outside the markets, outside those constraints, and the money literally comes out of thin air.
Jim, I have to ask you, are we looking then at sort of a one world government that's being formed? And then as a follow-up question, what about what increasingly seems to be America's adversaries? Putin is being blamed for everything that goes wrong in this country now. We won't allow the Chinese to control their own sea lanes. Those seem to be adversarial countries that are doing what they can to try to protect their own sovereignty, it seems to me anyway. That's my read of it. And so they're setting up their own the great the new infrastructure that allows them to trade and move goods around, and railroads and transportation networks as well as financial networks. I think they've set up something akin to the SWIFT system once, at least when we told Russia they couldn't be a part of that anymore. So how does this all play out? Are we destined for some sort of a serious global military conflict in the midst of all this?
Well, 3 different questions, Jay. I'll take the first one, which is there a long-term global elite plan for world government, world taxation, world money? The answer is yes, and I talk about this in the book. The world government infrastructure is there. It's not primarily the United Nations, by the way. It's the G20. The G20 meets formally at the head of state level. They met most recently on September 4th in Hangzhou, China. And they have large working groups, and they have a final communique and a lot of papers. It was the G20 meeting in Brisbane, Australia, in November 2014 that formalized the bail-in plan as opposed to the bail-out plan. That's where they take stockholder money, depositor money, and bondholder money to fix up the banks. So that's kind of the board of directors of the International Monetary System using the IMF as a central bank. So it's just the way the Federal Reserve is a central bank and has a board of governors. The IMF is the central bank of the world, and its board of governors are the G20 heads of state. So that then with the the United Nations as ancillary to that. By the way, there are a number of organizations, I talk about all of them in the book, they farm out these tasks. So there's something called the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the major developed economies, OECD. They are working on the global tax plan. It has a funny name, BEPS, B-E-P-S, Base Erosion and Profit Shifting. So if you ever see OECD BEPS, if you don't know what it means, just think global taxation and you've got it. So the United Nations is taking the lead on climate change. The OECD is taking the lead on global taxation. The IMF will take the lead on world money, and it's all being directed by the G20. But again, this is not futuristic. This is not to frighten people. This is all here today. It's happening. Now, as far as World War III is concerned, it already started. It's going on right now between Russia and the United States. It's not kinetic warfare. It's cyber warfare. Now I think a lot of people have familiarity with cyber attacks. So you hack into the operating system or the control system of some critical infrastructure like the Hoover Dam, and then you open the floodgates and you drown 300,000 people in their sleep by just flooding, letting the water flood downstream. We're also familiar with financial warfare, and I helped facilitate the first financial war game in 2009, run by the Pentagon. Well, imagine combining the two, combining cyber warfare and financial warfare into cyber financial warfare. That's what's going on. Now, the Russians could shut down the New York Stock Exchange tomorrow. That's child's play. But a more sophisticated form of attack would be to get inside the order entry systems, say Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and others, and start spoofing orders, sending a flood of sellers, sell Google, sell Apple, sell Tesla, sell Facebook, boom, 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 IBM, etc. Do it on a day when the market is already down, 3-4%, a really bad day on the market, and then hit the sell button. That's called, in military parlance, that's called a force multiplier, where you have some force vector, but you have some other vector that makes it even more powerful when you combine the two. Markets could go down 30% in one day, a little more than happened 19 years ago, a couple weeks ago, in October 19th, 1987. So what's the purpose of warfare, kinetic warfare, where you're bombing bridges and factories? And it's to destroy the wealth and the morale of your enemy. Well, what if you could do it digitally, which you can? And, I bump into billionaires in Greenwich, Connecticut. I live not far from there, and they're happy to tell you, I own stocks and I own bonds and I own this and that. And I say, no, you don't. You have electrons. Those electrons can be hacked, they can be erased, they can be wiped out. Good luck finding them again. Your wealth can disappear. So you need some tangible wealth, which, as I say, can be gold, silver, fine art, land. If you want to invest, you can do private equity or venture capital, where it's a written contract. The entrepreneur. You can knock on her door, knock on his door. Those are the kinds of things that last. But any digital asset is completely vulnerable to being wiped out.
Yeah, well, that's very important for people to realize that, and I think the lion's share of people are not aware of that. Well, your book is just full of huge amounts of very interesting topics, Jim. I just mentioned some of the chapters. Chapter 1, This is the End. Chapter 2, One Money, One World, One Order. Chapter 3, Desert City and the Mind. Chapter 4, Foreshock 1998. Chapter 5, Foreshock 2008. Chapter 6, Earthquake 2018. You mentioned that may or may not be, but we need to be ready for the earthquake that's coming, the financial earthquake. Chapter 7, Bonfire of the Elites. Chapter 8, Capitalism, Fascism, and Democracy. And Chapter 9, Behold a Black Horse, reference to the 6th chapter of the book of Revelations. And you mentioned that at the start, a very interesting passage. Of course, it's apocalyptic literature that was written initially for Christians that were being persecuted, I believe, after the fall of Rome, after the fall of Jerusalem, and into the early days of right after, probably up through AD 68 or something like that, or 89. Right. So it was a time to sort of give hope to the Christians, or to the people that were being persecuted at that point in time. So what is the bottom line for your book? There is hope. I mean, there's what you're trying to do, and what you do, I think you're doing an amazing job of, Jim, is providing people with information they need to survive and to protect their families in an environment that is going to make that very, very difficult unless they have the knowledge to do so, right?
That's right. There's something, Jay, called the self-negating prophecy. I think a lot of people have heard of the self-fulfilling prophecy, where something's not happening, but you say it's going to happen, and then people believe it, and the next thing you know, it's happening because everyone's acting, the classic run on the bank, everything's fine at the bank, but somebody starts a rumor, and next thing you know, some people run down to get their money out, and the line forms, and by the end of the day, the bank is broke. Well, there's also the self-negating prophecy, which is if you can provide enough warning and enough basically explaining it to people, maybe there'll be some policy actions or some fixes where it doesn't happen, and that's a great result. I've had people say to me, "Boy, Jim, I read your book. I hope you're wrong," and I say, "So do I." But maybe I'm not, and at least this is how things are going to play out if we don't make some changes, and we can either make the changes or at least be warned.
One last question before I leave you go. A Trump presidency, more or less dangerous in terms of the financial?
I think it's a lot less dangerous. I think it'll be, almost our last chance. Look, Trump is unpredictable. You never know what he's going to say next. But with Hillary, you're going to get more of the same. You're going to get the same kind of appointments, the same kind of policies. We're on the wrong path, so we continue on the wrong path. And I think my book would play out exactly the way I lay it out. With Trump, there's sort of good news, bad news. The good news is I think he'll choose a different path. The bad news is the global elites are going to stand in his way every step of the way, and maybe they'll even precipitate something just to make him look bad. So I think either way, investors need to be prepared.
Yeah, I was going to wonder if President Kennedy thought he was the president and didn't have time to realize he wasn't. But anyway, I should stop with that thought probably before it gets too gloomy, because your book does provide some hope, Jim. I want to thank you very much for being with us again. And where is the best place to buy it? I guess you can buy it on Amazon now. You can pre-order it there. You can. How do they buy it?
Correct. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Actually, the independent booksellers have a website. It's the official publication date is November 15th, so it'll be in bookstores on November 15th. But before then, you can pre-order it. I'm happy to say we're the number one bestseller in the money category on Amazon. So we're actually beating books that are already on the bookshelves. And for those who are interested in an autographed copy, you can go to my website, jamesrickardsproject.com. That's jamesrickardsproject.com. And we have a widget. You can buy it from the places I mentioned. And if you put your confirmation code in and address, we'll mail you an autograph booklet. And they're real autographs. We don't use a robo pen. I actually flew back from Australia the other day. I signed 600 of them on the plane. So we have thousands more good to go. So, I'm really very appreciative of those who are interested.
Oh, that's a fantastic offer. Thank you very much, James. Always good to hear from you. Always insightful, always potentially life-saving information. So thanks again for being with us. Look forward to doing it again sometime soon.
Thanks, Jay.